thank you everyone for coming. Thank you, Najam Sethi, for coming, for making the time. It's very kind of you. We're going to start this off with a brief conversation, but we want to leave enough time for all of you to ask questions. Please think of questions, and I'm sure we will have enough time at the end. We will need to vacate this room at 1:45 because there's a lecture at 2, and the room will need to be rearranged. It's a real pleasure to be able to chair this, not only because of the speaker, whom, as I just mentioned, I've known for a while, and I'm meeting him after a long gap, but also because of the subject that Sethi Sahib is going to speak on today. But before that, just by way of humorous introduction, if you want to read about Najam Sethi, you really must look at his website, which is, I think, najamsethi.com. But if you looked at Wikipedia, it says that he's a former Marxist. Now, that's always very good because I consider myself a Marxist on sabbatical. So I'm sure this is going to be very, 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 very interesting. Najam Sahib is going to speak. There are some questions I have that I hope will trigger a conversation. But before that, this is for the audience. How many of you actually know the PMDA ordinance, the content of it, outside of what you may have heard on media? How many of you actually know what it is, what the content is, what it asks to do? Because otherwise, what Najam Sahib is going to say is going to actually not quite anchor with all of you. All of you know? Some of you know? Okay. I will very quickly read out a couple of salient points, literally 2 or 3, just so that all of you understand how we are pegging this conversation, because otherwise its official name is the Pakistan Media Development Authority Ordinance 2021, dated Islamabad, the 7th of May, 2021. Begins with, whereas it is expedient to provide for the development of films, electronic media, and digital media in order to establish Pakistan as a major global center for multimedia information and content services, and goes on and on. Clause 3 is the most important clause, which is called Establishment of the Authority, and it actually lists all the functions, the duties that this ordinance will perform. It is important to know that the ordinance will actually have a physical office. So it is not an ordinance in law alone. The principal office of the authority shall be at Islamabad, with its regional offices in Karachi, Lahore, Quetta, Peshawar, and at such place or places in the country as it may deem appropriate. This is clause 3.3. Clause 4 is functions of the authority. There are 21 functions listed alphabetically, A to U, which are all very much in line with what is usually there. But there is one very important clause, which is clause H, which is to investigate and adjudicate on complaints and other claims made against licensees arising out of alleged contraventions of the provisions of the ordinance, the rules and regulations made, and licenses or registration certificates issued thereunder, and taken action accordingly. Okay. Clause L says to perform such other functions as the federal government may from time to time assign to it. Okay. Now, the reason why clause H is important, which is about licenses and contravention of licenses, is because it is to be read with clause 21, which is terms and conditions of license, under which clause 21A says, and please listen to this carefully, conditions requiring the licensee registration certificate or declaration or NOC, that's no objection certificate, to ensure preservation of the sovereignty, security, and integrity of the Islamic Republic of Pakistan. And 21B, conditions to ensure preservation of the national, cultural, social, and religious values and the principles of public policy as enshrined in the Constitution of the Islamic Republic of Pakistan. So this is 27 pages. So my summary is absolutely very, very skeletal because these are some of the things that are sure to come up. But just to start off the conversation, Najam Sahib, what is your response to the PMDA, just generally speaking?
First, thank you very much for inviting me here today. I was advised by my boss, the good wife, that I should not be attending events where there are lots of people because I'm shit scared of COVID. And I'm one of the few people who's so scared that I've got 4 shots under my belt, 2 the Chinese and 2 from Pfizer. Having said that, it's all, and I said to her, I said, no, I would love to interact with students. But in many ways, one is still a student, one is still learning. And so it really is a pleasure to be here today. And thank you very much for giving me this opportunity to interact with you. The subject that you've decided that I should speak on is media freedom and media restrictions and censorship. But of course, it's a subject that's very close to my heart because it affects me all the time. At some stage or the other, I'm adversely impacted by it. In recent times, I've been ousted from the mainstream media because my thoughts or my words are unacceptable to the powers that be. And the powers that be in the last 3 years are both the government in power and the what you might call the establishment, which is really the military establishment. And I'm not going to mince my words by calling it the establishment. It's the military, the leadership of the military. I call it the military establishment or the mil-tablishment for the sake of local media trying to get my thoughts across. Very broadly, I'll touch upon the issues at stake, but I think my suspicion is that you guys may be a little bit more interested in what the hell is going on back home and whether we're going to come out of this new crisis or not and whatnot. So I leave space for questions on that issue too. You know, the first, and I'm going to be very brief before I come to the PDMA. I have lived through like 7 or 8 regimes. My first entry into journalism was in 1985. I wrote a long 5,000-word piece for the Muslim that used to be a newspaper, an independent newspaper in Islamabad. It was edited by a friend and a journalist, Mushahid Hussain. Those are the years, and Mushahid called me up and said, I can't print this. And I said, but you know, it was an assessment of what was going on and what we might expect after Zia. And he said, I can't print this. But to cut a long story short, eventually it was printed in 8 parts and it was mangled and distorted and censored and cut very, very brutally. So, I mean, I didn't think it made any sense after the censors had been through it. But that was my first foray into journalism. And then Zia left and you had an interim government came in for 3 months to conduct the next elections in 1988. And they passed a new ordinance which took away the restrictions that had been imposed on the print media. That was all they wanted at that time. We had to get all sorts of permissions to be able to publish a newspaper. And if any one of you has ever read Emma Duncan's book, Breaking the Curfew, I would still regard it as a classic. Emma Duncan was the Pakistan correspondent of The Economist in those days. And she came and interviewed Zia, and then she ended up writing a book called Breaking the Curfew. And there's a paragraph in it about the difficulties of obtaining a license to print a newspaper or to stop one from being cancelled. And it's very illustrative. And if for no other reason, you should go and check that one paragraph out. It tells you about our travails and tribulations when we were trying to get permission to publish the Friday Times. Eventually, the permission came through and after Zia left, and Benazir came in. And I must tell you that those 2 years of Benazir years from 1990, from 1988 to 1990 were like a breath of fresh air. There was so much expectation, so much hope. And we suddenly felt free to be able to write what we like and so on. But then those 2 years came to an end and Nawaz Sharif came in. And Nawaz Sharif was a product of the military establishment and he had no qualms about putting us down. So then there were 3 bad years from 90 to 93. And I was particularly targeted and we had a very rough time, but survived. And then came Benazir came back and she was again very liberal. She was constantly complaining about the din of democracy, but she never actually put us down. So the media had a fairly good reign. run. Then Nawaz came back and he was bad again. And this time he was worse because he wanted to be Amirul Momineen. And we were all in trouble. And then he left and Musharraf came in. And I remember the day Musharraf took over, where all of us who had never supported martial law, who had always fought for democracy or stood up for it, we suddenly realized that there was a so-called military dictator who was determined to give up, to open up space for everyone. And therefore, during Musharraf's time, an incredible thing happened. And ironic, here was a military dictator, and he opened up the media to the electronic media. Hitherto, Benazir and Nawaz had both denied us rights to open up channels. Musharraf opened it all up, gave everybody licenses, and there was a blossoming of electronic media. And there was a free-for-all. And there was no attempt by Musharraf to stop us. I think one reason was that everybody was so anti-Benazir and Nawaz Sharif and had been so oppressed by at least one of them that they were delighted that there was a military guy who was saying, go on, go on. And some of his reform agenda was also quite appealing to a lot of people. So he had a good time with the media and he allowed us to flourish. Then came the end of Musharraf. And by the time the end came, he was again turning against the media. Because Zahira, when the end comes, the media has to reflect the end. And when the media began to tell the story of Musharraf's downfall, he cracked down and he closed down several channels. So by the time democracy came back after Musharraf's ouster, people were expectant. And the People's Party came to power. And when the People's Party came to power, Asif Zardari, after Benazir's death, there was no attempt to gag the media. We were free again. Zardari leaves, Nawaz comes in. No attempt by Nawaz to gag the media. Nawaz had turned 180 degrees. He'd done an incredible U-turn. He'd suddenly become a Democrat, and he'd suddenly decided that there was no question of intimidating the media and so on. And he started talking about some of the things that we'd been talking about all our lives. So we really got used to the idea of a free media, especially in electronic media. And then came the current dispensation. And I remember a conversation I had with both the leaders of the military establishment here in London 2 years ago, when they were visiting. And I think the first question on their mind was how to manage the media. The media is the source of trouble. The media has to be managed and controlled. And I think that's been the attitude of the government in power also, that the media has to be controlled and managed. It's the not the medium, but the media that is creating the difficulties. We are all naked and pious, and the media has to be controlled. So what you hear now about all these new laws that are coming in place to control the media, it's not even to manage the media, it's to control the media, basically to shut it down. And we've seen what has been happening in the last 3 years. One by one, every independent journalist has been ousted from the electronic channels or for the newspapers they write. And I'm sure all of you know, I don't need to take names. There are at least a dozen or 2 dozen people who are now not even being able to eke out a living from social media because they've all been told to get lost. Some of them have also been picked up and advised to behave or else. Some have fled the country and are living here and in America and in Canada. And the mainstream media is now in their control because the owners are all lined up behind the government or the military. But the independent media is now only out there in social media. And in social media, you have all sorts of problems. It's actually a free-for-all. It's now the other extreme. And but at the end of the day, you have to decide whether you want to be part of this stream or extreme or part of this. And so there are gradations on both sides. But I must tell you that this particular law that this government wants to promulgate, and I think, Dr. Saab, you put your finger on it. If you read through it, you will all see what it means. At the end of the day, it basically says that everybody who wants to open his mouth in Pakistan has to get a permission from the government, an NOC. This notion of an NOC means that it is not your right to do certain things. We have to grant you that right. You have no rights except other those that we grant you. Whereas the Constitution says that these are rights guaranteed by the Constitution, and that we don't need anybody's permission. And that there are laws in place, that if we violate any of the laws when we talk about things, then there are laws to check us. But apparently that's not good enough for this government. And so therefore, what's now about to happen, any day, literally any day, they're going to try and push this through a joint session of parliament, where they have a majority of 3 or 4, and which 3 or 4 have to be brought in line by the military establishment to get in there and vote. So we have a very difficult situation. And the free media that you see on the sidelines, whether this is now on YouTube or in social media, all of this will come to an end. The day we have to apply for an NOC, the NOC is not going to be granted. The interesting thing about NOCs is, let me give you 1 or 2 examples of NOCs. Every time a government servant has to leave the country, he needs an NOC, and no objection certificate from his superiors. It can be denied, it can be withheld, it can be ignored. Your request will be ignored. There is no reprieve. There is no way you can go to somebody and say, I've applied to you for an NOC, please give it to me. Or say no. If you say no, I'll go to the courts. But what happens is they neither say yes nor no, they just sit on your application. And I'll just give you one example. 3 years ago, I received a notice from the local intelligence in Punjab saying that I needed to be careful because they had heard chatter that the Taliban were angry with me and may try to take me out, and that I needed to be protected, and that they were sending a police force to protect me. I immediately applied for what is called an armored vehicle. I said, I'll buy the armored vehicle. You give me police protection, but that's not enough. Anybody can do anything in this country. So I need an armored vehicle, and I'm happy to pay for it and buy it. You can give me an NOC. By law, I have the right for an NOC for an armored vehicle. By law. Those are the rules. All I have to do is establish that I face a threat. As long as I can establish that, then it's my right to buy an armored vehicle at my own expense. I submitted the letter from the CID department to the Interior Ministry saying, here is a letter from the Punjab government that says that I'm under threat and they're deputing a police guard. Can I have a license, an NOC? It has taken me 3 years to go up and down Islamabad to every agency, every police station in town, and to apply every method I know before I have now finally been able to get an NOC. It has taken me 3 years. They never said yes, they never said no. They just sat on it. And every time I would ask, where is my NOC? They'd say it's being processed. So what I'm trying to say is this, that the NOC is the worst form of censorship you can impose. Number one. Number two, even if you get it now, even if they give it to you for a year, next year they will not give it to you. They will sit on it and they will tell you, you can't do this, you can't do this, you can't do this. And then the sort of fines that are now being mentioned, it's going to be impossible for anybody to say anybody. And the exodus from mainstream to YouTube is, that pressure is now going to come on YouTube, because under the new laws, we have to register ourselves, even to be able to operate on YouTube. So therefore, I fear that if things carry on like this, there will be no such thing as media freedom. I'll leave it there. There are lots of questions and answers that need to be addressed, but I'll leave it there for the time being.
Could I ask you one thing? Thank you very much. That was very eloquent. May I ask, what you are saying, it's interesting, Britain has, for those of you who live in Britain, there is Ofcom, which is the office that oversees communications on all platforms. And people can complain to Ofcom if there is anything objectionable that is shown, or etc. But of course, it works from the other end, which is you are innocent till you're proved guilty, and it works in reverse. But a lot of the details of this ordinance, Pakistan is not unique in attempting to or trying to institute an ordinance that looks at media regulation. Whether or not it will end media freedom or not is a subjective discussion, but looking at media regulation. Where do you think this works in a larger global picture? Because it isn't unique to Pakistan, as you very well know.
Yeah, you're right. It's not unique. Things are pretty rough in India these days as well. But at the end of the day, you can have all the laws in the world. But it's a question of how you implement those laws and what recourse there is to justice. If your justice system is strong and the laws are bad, then you still have a sense that you at the end of the day, you may be able to walk your way through it. But if the justice system is rigged and the laws are rigged, then there's very little scope. I mean, take this country. The defamation laws are so strong in this country that and they're implemented. Take our country. We have the same defamation law. Word for word is the same defamation law in India and in Pakistan. But I'll just give you one example. 7 years ago, Imran Khan accused me of rigging the election and said that I had rigged 35 seats, the famous Panty Puncher case. I went through hell. My family went through hell. Imran Khan was Imran Khan. Everybody believed him. The new generation believed him more than the older generation, but everybody believed him. Wherever I went, people would look at me, with that look as if to say, you rigged the election. And I cannot tell you how terrible those years were for me. And I, who had worked so hard to ensure that it would be a fair election in Punjab, where I was leading the administration. And I was shocked that he made this allegation a year after the elections were over. So then there was a judicial commission was set up to examine these allegations. And 6 months of deliberations by the judicial commission headed by an ex-chief justice selected and nominated on the recommendations of Imran Khan. The verdict was no, they were not rigged. There were usually irregularities here and there, but there was no systematic rigging, and nor were they rigged to the extent that it would have affected the results. I met Imran in the courtroom. And by the way, Imran and I go back a long way. We've done a lot of things together in the old days. So I'll just leave it at that. And I said to him, all that is required is for you to say sorry. And this will be the end of the matter. Eventually, I took him to court. It's been 7 years. Even then, 3 years ago, he turned around in an interview and said, oh, I just said it for the echo. It was a political statement. Now, the other fellow, the second guy who accused me of the same thing, has turned around and said, I didn't mean it, I just said it. I've taken both of them to court. Not one of them has had the decency to come to court, to attend the court hearings. And the judge hasn't had the courage to call Imran Khan to court. It's been 7 years. We've had over 70 hearings. Every time my lawyer goes there, the other side says no. There's no. Eventually, after much threats from my lawyer, the Imran Khan's lawyer, and this other Shahid Massoud's lawyer filed their replies to my initial accusation. Shahid Massoud said I'd heard it from Imran. Imran said I'd heard it from him. And there the matter rests to this day. And now on the urge, I've just learned that the judge has now suddenly woken up. He sees the winds changing. He sees the end is nigh. Things are moving. Perhaps there will be change. The judge has woken up to say, if the Prime Minister will not attend, then I will have to take a decision ex parte, meaning without hearing you, if you're not going to attend, then what the hell? And suddenly everybody's become very active. Shahid Massoud has gone online to apologize to me itself. So I just heard it from someone and I just said. And of course, Imran hasn't done anything of the sort, and he's not going to. I mean, that's the way he is. So that's how bad the defamation law is. If we have the laws, if only the court system was strong enough to deal with these issues. And now what happens is Shahbaz Sharif gets all over the coals in Pakistan And suddenly one day a British court says it's a green light for him. And suddenly in Pakistan, everybody wakes up and says, what's going on? One small court over here, one judgment is worth 1 million judgments in Pakistan. So you have the laws are all there. So to answer your question, it's all a question of the environment. It's a question of how the government of the day feels. It's a question of how strong the judiciary is and whether or not you can defend yourself in the presence of such laws.
Are you saying that the problem is not with the law or the laws, but with the institutions which are not robust enough to be able to execute?
Both. You see, if the law was fair, the institution would not have a problem dealing with it. But if the law is unfair and there's pressure on the institution to adjudge in the institution's favor, in favor of the law, and you know how our judiciary has been a handmaid to the executive, then a bad law just ends with making matters worse. But if there's a good law, you know that if not today, tomorrow, day after, at some stage or the other, you may get relief when perhaps the pressure from the establishment to the executive is not so powerful. So at the end of the day, you know, we need some of the laws are good and there's due process, and that's good. But at the end of the day, if the government of the day is determined to screw you, I don't think there are too many judges who will stand up. And so you do get screwed.
All right. I'll come back to some of the things you've said, but shall we ask for a round of questions? Anyone has questions till now? This being an on-site event, you have the right to ask a question anonymously, or you can also introduce yourself. Go ahead.
My name is Shahir.
You can take your mask off. Put it back after your question.
My name is Shahir. I'm a second-year politics history student from Karachi. My question for you is, you referred to as PPP's years in power and some of Nawaz's years in power as no active attempt to gag the media. But surely even those years, the military must have had some do's and don'ts for the media. So how were they implemented, and how do you see that changing in the future? Like, how do you see the military backing up on their motivation to stop gagging the media?
You see, in the earlier days, the government had various levers of influence and leverage basically over the print media or even over the electronic. And that was, for example, we could not import newsprint. We needed to have an NOC from the government of the day and quotas. So the government controlled the import of newsprint in order to influence newspapers. We were not towing the line. Next time you apply
Sorry, do all of you know what newsprint is? You're of a generation that might not know.
Newsprint is the paper on which newspapers are printed. It's a special service. And while the rest of the paper was available for free import, newsprint was controlled by the government. And all newspapers had to apply for NOCs or licenses to import newsprint. So that was one lever. Second was advertising. We've had a very big public sector. Private sector has been growing, but not as rapidly, or as it's not such a significant factor. But the government sector in advertising has been so handouts in terms of advertising from government corporations and the ministries. So those are the two main levers. You were not behaving, they'd cut off your newsprint. You were not behaving, they'd stop the advertising. You were behaving, they'd increase the advertising. So newspaper editors and owners were going up and down, running to Islamabad, saying sorry, coming back, to being good boys for 2 days and then bad boys for 3 days. There was a constant toing and froing. So those are the sort of levers, but you didn't hear of people being arrested in the middle of the night and being put behind bars and so on. Not during Benazir's time. During Nawaz's time, yes, there was all manner of issues, and I suffered. He had me arrested and put behind bars. I was writing stuff that he didn't like in those days. But as I said, so much has changed from those days to these days that the same media that actually supported Imran Khan and helped him climb the ladder, this media is one of the main reasons for his success. And he himself has admitted that on many occasions. He now realizes that the same media can be his downfall. And so he's out to clip it. And Nawaz Sharif has become another man in many ways. And so therefore, those are the exigencies of politics in our part of the world.
Anyone else? Go ahead.
Thank you very much for coming, sir. What you stated as the potential application of this law, especially when it comes to social media and YouTube in particular, it seems very worrying because now journalists, prominent journalists who've been out from the mainstream media, they take refuge in YouTube. So if it comes to that and they're required to get an NOC for YouTube as well, do you see anywhere they could go from there, or there's just no platform then?
There's no platform beyond that because they're going to target every platform. Today's YouTube, it will apply to every form of social media, whether it's Instagram or whether it's Facebook or whatever it is. There may be new forms, but it will affect all of those. So therefore, really, this is going to be the big suffocation. And as I said, the entire discretion will be in the hands of the government in power. This law will stay and the next government will come in, and again, it will depend on how it's treated. Because you see, at the end of the day, that we will be able to go back and challenge it. Say they stop me from doing so. They say, I apply for an NOC. My sense is they'll not say no, they'll not say yes, they'll just sit on it. And if I try and do it without the NOC, then they'll slap me and they'll drag me off somewhere or the other to deal with it. And then I'll have to run to the courts. And I don't know. It depends on how the courts will see the situation. If the courts think that the executive is not strong, they might decide in my favor, they might give me a stay order. But if the pressure from the establishment or from the government of the day is strong on the judge, so it will all depend on the environment, the political environment in the country. This at the moment is pretty bad.
Go ahead.
Yes, thank you so much for coming. My name is Essen, and I would thank you so much for coming. My name is Essen, and so I would like to ask that you talked a bit about the judiciary. So, what would you say is like the role of the judiciary in protecting the journalist, and with the current so-called blasphemy and anti-terrorism laws which this government has enforced? What would you say is like the role of the judiciary in like protecting the journalist from here?
Look, I mean, the lower judiciary is too weak to stand up for anything. And they are ruled by the local advocate generals of the government, the provincial government, the deputy commissioners and so on. So, the local magistrates will do exactly as the executive tells them to do. Number one. And number two, they're too scared to take on religious matters. And also they're inclined to be very conservative by nature and by upbringing and by education. So to expect that any human rights will be monitored or upheld at the local level is not on. I mean, it's not going to happen. So you're going to lose your case, whether it's blasphemy or whether it's women's rights or whatever it is, harassment, whatever it is. You're not going to get any relief at the lower level. I mean, I'm making a general statement. When you go up to the High Court, then the chances are that you will, unless it's blasphemy or something of that level, in which case the police, the instructions of the police are to arrest you before they, and the argument is they're arresting you to protect you. They arrest you immediately and whisk you away from that area and put you into a police thana 200 miles away so that those guys who are getting together to lynch you are unable to get there, and they're able to protect you. And then it goes on and on and on because no judge is ready to either give a verdict against you or a verdict in your favor, because the judge knows that the government doesn't want a verdict against you because the international community is going to go haywire and they don't want anything. But they don't have the courage to say, no, we're going to put a stop to this, because then, of course, you incur the wrath of everybody else. And so, I mean, there are lots of people who are now in prison without, I mean, the trial is just an unending trial. There's no reprieve, there's no conviction. And even when there are convictions, and then you go all the way up to the High Court, and you're just sitting there for years. Nobody has the courage to take you out, unless there's an outcry by the international community and you become a cause célèbre, like we did during Asma Jangir's time. She would make sure that when something like this happened, it became a cause célèbre. There was pressure on the government and on the judiciary to do something. And she and her colleagues would stand up for some of these rights. And so you got some relief. But then with the relief came the threat. Asma was under death threats all the time. And then the minute you get some reprieve, just whisk the person away out of the country, otherwise they'll kill him or her, as the case may be. So, it's a pretty bad situation out there. And, the thing is this, that I'm saying this on record, that anyone can be accused of anything. Anyone can be accused of anything in our circumstances. And all you need is an accusation that you're alleged to have desecrated this or desecrated that. And then there's no reprieve. It is a threat and a sword that hangs over everyone's head. And you don't have to be a non-Muslim. Many of the cases refer to Muslims who are alleged to have said un-Muslim like this.
Anyone else?
So about the topic,
You can take your mask off.
So I basically recently was watching a talk show where like a prominent government minister basically used a couple of terms like aspire, Jewish conspiracy, but the word that I was most intrigued by was fake news. And that's why we need to media. So what exactly is fake news and why is like the government only worried about it and not the opposition? So,
Yeah, well, in my book, fake news is news that has been manufactured to create a particular impact, which has no bearing to facts or realities. In fact, is often opposite. The opposite is the case. And we have, in the past, the government of the day used to be propagandistic, which is their right. If they look at only one set of facts and not look at the other set of facts. And it was the media that was occasionally accused of sensationalizing something or distorting something or putting something out of context. And so the government of the day then started calling all this fake news. Whereas I don't think that's fake news. My sense of fake news is something that is deliberately with the motivation, a hard reality is distorted beyond recognition with a particular aim to fool people or to sway them or to do something like that. And often the originator of fake news are either intelligence agencies, domestic or foreign. It can be the government of the day, but it is very rare for a newspaper to consciously, with some motivation in mind, to publish or present fake news. It can be done, it does happen. Occasionally you hear something and you see it reported on some site and a journalist is quick to pick it up and without checking to see whether it's authentic or not, to do it. But I think the real originator of fake news now are the intelligence agencies and the government of the day.
You first.
So my question is, I guess, related to regulation of social media. So the PMDA ordinance claims that this is going to, have a positive impact in terms of what's put on social media. But we all know that may not necessarily be the case. That said, when we think about things like sort of Twitter propaganda, these like state-sponsored Twitter accounts that, put up random kind of like trends, making them, prominent, what can we do to address that sort of, I guess, fake news, like spreading of fake news or what?
Sorry, come again. Would you like to come up a little bit because I can't.
Okay, sure. I'll try to project. My bad. So my question is, we know that the PMDA ordinance will not do anything to curb. It's more controlling social media rather than positively regulating it. But when we think about sort of state-promoted Twitter accounts, for instance, and real actual fake news that's trending in that regard. What do you think is a good way to address that to make sure that there's good fact checking and some troll on social media?
I think, let me answer that. In 2009, I was at an international conference somewhere or the other, and the issue of Twitter and what a revolutionary device for journalists Twitter would be, because Twitter would enable citizen reporting. If something happened somewhere, even before a journalist could get there, citizens would report on it. And the idea was that this would be the fastest way of getting information across. But that, of course, is still the case. I mean, it's still Twitter that gives you the latest in terms of what's happening now, including with video shots and so on. even before the mainstream media can get to it. But it's true that Twitter also gives you a handle to basically do what you like. And what has been happening is that what we were talking about, fake news, has also wormed its way into Twitter, as we can see. And Twitter has also been enabled by propagandists to use it for propaganda purposes. It has been used in America to affect an election and so on, and it happens in our part of the world as well. So, and now you have this whole business of troll armies. And there are, there are two types of troll armies. There are those who are ideologically motivated in one way or the other. So they become an army, a de facto army. But then there are these guys who are now sitting in a room like this. There are 50 of them sitting there with each one controlling 20 accounts or 30 accounts. And before you know it, they can run up a trend in half an hour. And you have no, I mean, now all the books that one is reading on it, the psychological impact of trolling is hugely hurtful and damaging, and psychologically so. And even though I know where the trolling is coming from, the minute I see that abuse being hurled at me, it shakes you up. I mean, and I often ask many of my friends, I said, look, why don't you go and counter this? They say, are you mad? The trolls will come for us. And I'm not committed enough to say that, speak the truth here or to defend somebody, because I'm afraid they'll come for me. And I can't deal with this. My family can't deal with it, the trolling that takes place. And, the interesting thing is this, that I have first-hand information about how these troll farms were set up for the first time under this government. And during Benazir's time and Nawaz Sharif's time, even as late as 2018, this figure, the only trolling that was taking place, or the only troll farms, were those that Jahangir Tareen was running on behalf of the PTI when it was in opposition. And then, of course, now the military establishment has a huge trolling outfit. My sense is a lot of it is directed domestically than it is internationally, to put down people and to target people. And so really, I feel that it's going to be very difficult to deal with this issue. I have dealt with it. I say to other people, you should deal with it, but it's not the easiest thing in the world. I deal with it because I gave my phone away to a very dear colleague of mine. And I said, anybody who abuses me, just block them. I don't want to know what they're saying. I don't want to see what they're saying. I don't want to lose my sleep over it. And I don't want my kids to see it. Just block these buggers and be done with it. But not everybody can hire somebody to be constantly on the lookout for abuse. Fair comment, disagreement, absolutely, it's important to know. But abuse is of a kind that shakes you up. And it is a lot of it is part of the trolling. So the government, of course, is now putting pressure on Facebook and on Twitter to give access to people who are using these accounts to criticize the government. And every day, somebody or the other I know will receive a message from Twitter to say that there's been a complaint against you. Even though I know that person to be a very responsible journalist. But I know they're sending out these complaints in the hundreds so that at least some of them will stick. And my friends who are in Twitter, one or two close friends work for Twitter, tell me that this is, what can we do? We have to treat each complaint. And when we receive X number of complaints, we do send out these notes. But, just ignore them because we know where they're coming from. And so I'm afraid the jury is still out on social media. The pros and cons of social media and how or whether or not we'll ever be able to tame it. I think the international community and the corporations are looking into this because, as you know, it is both these platforms, Facebook and Twitter, have been used for all manner of criminal activity as well. So people are looking into it. I don't know where it is.
Could I ask you something by actually juxtaposing two sets of things that you've said? On the one hand, you're talking about rights, liberties that are enshrined in the Constitution of Pakistan and therefore guaranteed to citizens of Pakistan. which includes freedom, and that freedom includes freedom of speech. Alongside that, the new PMDA, which, as you said, tries in every possible way to circumscribe precisely that freedom, and in fact, overrules all other existing laws that may be used to counter this. So that's it. You just, in the context of Twitter, also spoke about the harm that it can potentially cause and how people who use a platform like Twitter are themselves unable to handle what it brings. The question is this: do you think there should be regulation of media and freedom within the media of any sort? Or do you think freedom is a limitless right to be executed, and it should function through consideration of social values, which then makes it a very subjective and individual thing, and I can tell you does not happen even in this country.
No, there's no such thing as absolutely. No such thing. My freedom stops beyond my nose, your freedom begins. The question really is, who is to determine those areas which are blurred, or which are protected or unprotected? And I think that's where the debate will constantly be in terms of this. My right is extended up to this point, and beyond that, my right will not go beyond. There's no such thing as a free market or as total freedom. All even free markets need to be regulated. Corporations need to be regulated. On the other hand, the wholesale nationalization of all space is also unacceptable. So these are, I think, perennial human dilemmas of society. And different societies are at different stages of cultural and political development, where some of them are better able to deal with it and others are not so able to deal with it. This society is better able to deal with it. It's a cultured, developed society where norms and traditions are far more important, and actually the laws written on paper. And there's a sense of responsibility in civil society. Our societies pretend to be civil societies, but they're hardly civil societies. I mean, the whole notion of a civil society needs to be understood. What does civil society mean? What are the rights and obligations of individuals in a civil society? How do they all together form part of a civil society? I mean, I was asked once, what is, had to grapple with this issue of whether or not people with extremist religious views are also part of civil society. They're certainly part of society, but are they part of civil society? What does it mean to be part of civil society? My sense is the whole notion of civil society and civilization in that context arose out of the whole notion of constitutionalism and democracy. You can't have civil societies in non-democratic society. Civil is by definition an empowerment of the civilian or of the civilian entity. So I think we need to look at the notion of civil society and see to what extent does civil society exist in Pakistan or not. And if it doesn't, then how do we deal with such
Thank you. It's interesting you should say this because, I always describe English society as the closest it comes to a textbook civil society. People who hate you will be nice to you. Consideration for others. That's civil. I'm walking, someone's coming from the other side of the road. There's a tree on the footpath. I'm going to stop to make way. When I've gone past, I'm going to abuse you because you stopped me, but you won't get to them. That's civil society because it shows consideration. What's interesting also is
tolerance, civil activity,
and accommodation of discomfort and the other.
Yeah.
What is interesting in the case of Britain, of course, is also that Britain does not have a written constitution. So every evolution of the civicness of civil society has happened through customary practice in this society. Now, the point, however, remains that, yes, I agree with you that with what you're saying, I hear what you're saying, which is that freedom is not absolute. And this is an eternal civilizational dilemma. It's not something that's not specific to any country. But given that we are talking about media and all platforms of media, media is a facility of the civil society and the peoples that constitute that society, that country, that nation, that citizenry. What are in post-communist times, both you and I have also lived through the 70s and 80s, and when it was a very different thing. What do you foresee as potential issues arising from this kind of attempt to regulate? That's one part of my question. The attached part of the question is that I'm asking you this question because implicitly you have agreed that, like everything, media also does need some kind of regulation.
Yeah, my point is the rules and regulations are already there. You need to have an environment in which all sides obey those rules and regulations, and if one side disagrees, there should be due process for rectification. That is there. The need to have a new law where all those rights are taken away from you, and you are now told that this is not your right, this is our right, not your right. That's where my objection comes. This NOC business is unacceptable. We can challenge many of the other things as impinging on our rights, but this business that we have to first get a license from you to be able to say whatever we want to say, and that anything you don't like, without assigning any reason, you can withdraw that license. And as I said, the worst case scenario is you don't withdraw it, you don't give it to us. You just say, I'm not giving it to you. I mean, give you an example. I say something, they don't like it. Time's up, 1 year later, I apply for my relicensing, they don't issue it. I keep writing to them to say, please issue my license. They don't say, why are we not giving it to you? They don't reply to you. After 6 months of writing to them, you go to the courts, and you go to the courts and say, look, I've been trying to get this license and they're not giving me my license. So the court takes another 6 months to get them to come and give an answer. And the answer they're giving is, we're looking at it. And we will be processing it, or frivolous answer that this, he's supposed to have said this, so the whole thing starts from there. So that is where my objection comes. Right now, the media is protesting that their argument is we're putting all the other regulations together under one roof. That is not correct. I mean, the Constitution protects many of those things. And then this business of that we define what is in the national interest, we define what is national security, we define what is...
it uses the word security.
Yeah, I mean, I'll give you, again, let me give you a personal example. I was asked a question on television, live. This was at a time when an ex-army chief was retiring, and he was the recipient of lots of lands and plots. And the media was full of X billion rupees worth of goodies. And of course, the media had been full of the corruption of politicians. So I was asked a question that, politicians are corrupt. But tell me, this business of giving away state lands worth billions and plots and commercial plots for a song, is this not corruption? So it was a direct question aimed in a particular situation. I sort of shit, now how do I not answer this question? So I sort of hemmed and hawed because I knew it was going to be aimed directly at that chief. So I said, well, I suppose, and then I said, well, I suppose you could say that institutions make their own rules. They're not part of a law, nor are they part of a constitution. These are in-house rules. Those institutions are guided by their rules. And if the rule allows you to give away this, then that is the umbrella under which they seek to do so. So you might say this is a form of institutional corruption. The judiciary does it, the A does it, B does it, C. Within 15 days, the channel was threatened to sack me. 17 cases of sedition were lodged against me across the length and breadth of Pakistan. Sedition. About 200 fellows were collected to march on the streets asking me to be tried for treason. The Chief Secretary called me up and said, leave your house, they're going to march on your house today. You've spoken against the sacred cow. I had to run to a friend's house with my family because they were marching on my house. Of those 17 cases, 7 or 8 have been quashed, but the sword still dangles over my head. Last year when I was in England, my son called me up from Lahore and said, the police are here to arrest you. I said, what for? He said, this is the KP police. They sent somebody here to arrest you. It's in connection with what you said, because cases were registered in KP, Balochistan, Karachi and Punjab by unknown people. The same text in 17 cases. And I tried to get the cases shifted to one court. I said, they're all the same cases. In Balochistan, can we go to the Balochistan High Court? Can all of them be clubbed together? The Balochistan High Court said no. The Sindh High Court said yes. They brought all of them together and quashed them. The Balochistan High Court was under more pressure from other sources. He said, no, we can't. You go to Khuzdar and you go to there and you go there. I said, if I go there, I'm never coming back. Similarly, in KP, I was told to go to X place beyond nowhere land to go to a police station. And I didn't go. I said, okay, then come and arrest me. What else can I do? So, I mean, and by the way, they're still alive and kicking those cases. My position is I'm not going to apply for bail. And I'm saying, here, you want to come and take me, fine. And then we'll see what happens. So, of course, nothing has happened. The sword is there. So, to answer your question, this is the sort of stuff we face.
Just to remind everyone, the clause that Najam was referring to is 21A, which is conditions requiring the licensee registration certificate or declaration or NOC to ensure preservation of the sovereignty, security, and integrity of the Islamic Republic of Pakistan. That's where the word security is. Questions? You've asked a question. You've asked a question. You haven't asked a question. Okay, take your mask off.
You mentioned like the weakness of the judiciary.
Speak up, please.
You mentioned the weakness of the judiciary in like enforcing free speech. Do you envision a future whereby it has more of an active role, be that through regime change or government reform?
Sorry. Will the judiciary become more effective, powerful if there is a change in the regime?
There have been times when the judiciary has stood up, and there have been times when it's been the other way around. We now have a very interesting situation that, judges are not angels, and so often they are not able to control their own children, who are also not angels. And there's a lot of freedom in the air in terms of what you do with your own everyday lives. My sense is that the agencies have files on everyone. And a lot of unflattering stuff goes into those files. Most of it is allegations, but they're made to look like evidence. I say this because I've seen those files. I served for 3 months, I served in a cabinet in 1996, where I had access to some of this information. I sought it out because of my media. I said, I want to know what does the file say about me? I want to know what does the file say about so-and-so. And I can't tell you. It is all hearsay, evidence, words like it is thought, it is reported, it is said, and the file keeps going thicker and thicker. And anybody who looks at the file will get scared and say, my God, this is a real offender. And so the judges are inclined to be very cautious. And I know of very few judges who can actually give independent judgments where very powerful forces are arrayed against them. There have been cases, and you saw in one recent case how one judge has suffered enormously because he took a position on something very significant, which is rebounding today. His words were prophetic, what he said at that time when the Labaik was trying to destabilize the government, and so on. So the judiciary is, I like saying something these days. I like saying that when the judiciary sees that the central government is weak or is getting weak, the judiciary becomes stronger. And when it sees that the central government is strong, determined, has some sort of public mandate behind it, and the judiciary calms down. Right now, this perception is that the central government's power is slipping. It's into all manner of confrontations, become extremely unpopular. And a lot of hostility out there for the government of the day and its leader. The judiciary is beginning to flex its muscles a little bit. After 3 years, the judge had the courage to call the prime minister and say, why was action not taken against the terrorists who attacked the army school? A year ago, they wouldn't have had the courage to call the prime minister. Similarly, there was a time when a prime minister was called and sacked by the judiciary, Yusuf Raza Gilani, and so on. So there have been times, and then there have been times that the judges have just signed on the dotted line, whether it was the execution of Zulfikar Ali Bhutto. There's so many other cases, books of full.
Anyone else who hasn't asked? You at the very end, then you, then you.
Yeah.
You take your mask off.
You will have to speak up.
Yes, I will. So I guess my question is, in light of the serious curtailment of freedom of speech and the apparent inability of the judiciary to deal with it, what exactly would you say would be the solution to this? I mean, if the judiciary is only, I mean, if journalists can't rely on a regime change, changing the landscape of the media and the ability to speak freely, what exactly would need to change for journalists to be able to report freely? The judiciary is not the avenue to tackle this.
So if the judiciary is not a viable alternative for a journalist to go to when the journalist's rights are curtailed, what, according to you, needs to happen or needs to change or needs to be there for a journalist in Pakistan to be able to report freely?
I suppose at the back of our mind is always the case that if we are dragged off somewhere or the other, or if we are halted or we are stopped from doing something, we can always go to the judiciary to delay matters. Whether we get justice or not, the first step is to stop whatever is happening. And I must confess that on that score, the judiciary is very good. They may not give a judgment in your favor, but they will stop the government from proceeding against you if they think that this is unfair. And that is what the relief that you actually seek. I mean, what is in these matters, if I had gone for bail, the one I was talking about, they would have given me bail. And then I would have just sat back and said, okay, no problem. But so they're good at that. They'll give you bail. They'll give you a reprieve in terms of, okay, no action against such and such until we've seen the file, blah, 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 blah. And then, of course, then we take it from there. So there is some sense of immediate relief. We think we get that. And the judiciary is good on that. I think that's their way of compensation. That, okay, look, I mean, we may not be strong enough to give you justice, but we stop injustice from happening against you. Then you deal with it after that. You go and make up, kiss and make up.
Can I follow up on this? Yeah. So I guess my question is, but this account is very much an individual case-by-case basis, whereas what would happen? I mean, my question was more referring to an institutionalized structural, systemic change. Yeah. What would need to occur for systemic change to happen that would allow you to practice, to do your work freely, rather than courts giving individual.
I think the answer that you gave is essentially a default answer, which is that, I can't do this, which I'm supposed to be doing, but I can do something else, which I'm able to do, which may appear as reprieve to you. Whereas the student's question is, that's on a case-by-case basis, but what do you think institutionally or systemically needs to happen in structures of governance or in structures of civil society for the conditions to be created for any journalist in Pakistan to be able to report freely? And
it's not just a question of journalists being able to report freely. I mean, the quality of justice is strained. And that has to do with the quality of judges. It has to do with compensation, and it has to do with training. It has to do with education. There's a lot of factors here. And then, of course, there's this fact that judges are under enormous stress because there's a huge workload. Our judicial system, I mean, there's so much written on this, is not equipped to deal with the sort of complaints that are laid at its door. A lot of these complaints should not even be going to the high courts. They should be settled at local levels by local communities and constituents and reconciliation procedures and so on and so forth. But our judicial system is such that every little thing goes all the way up from a local council to a local court to a bigger court to a high court and then all the way to the Supreme Court. Elsewhere, Supreme Courts are constitutional courts, not in our case. Similarly, high courts should not be dealing with 90% of the cases that they deal with. They should all be resolved at local levels. But unfortunately, the notion of due process is so exaggerated in our part of the world that it takes forever. That is why it takes forever to resolve even a small case of a breach of contract, for example. I mean, a breach of contract should take place at a very low level, where and there should be no appeal beyond that, beyond a particular point. But the notion of due process and appeals against appeals, and then the question that you can't get a judgment out of a court in 10 days or 20 days or 15 days or 6 months. I mean, I know it takes time here as well, but at the end of the day, you do get judgments here, and you do get some relief or you're convicted. But in Pakistan, the rate of conviction is, I mean, the police is not equipped to it. There is no separate prosecution. The police is the one who arrests you, and the police is the one who prosecutes. And the police is not interested in prosecution. It's not equipped to deal with prosecution. So the judges end up having to deal with policemen or people of that caliber who are supposed to be presenting this. And there's no incentive. I mean, the police is so poorly paid. They are not pushed to go and collect evidence. And all they're doing is arresting people, putting them behind bars, forgetting about them, throwing them. That's all we're able to do. So you have hundreds of thousands of cases pending for 10 years or 20 years or 15 years. Often it's said that, if there's a property dispute and if in your lifetime you can get a judgment, which is final, you're a very lucky person. So this goes on and on and on. And by the way, most of the disputes are property related disputes, which have to do with land and so on, and contract. So, this is a complex issue. This has been debated and discussed threadbare in literature as well. But unfortunately, judicial reform is the last thing on the minds of judges or of administrators.
Is there anything else you think new as an institution which could be introduced, or are you saying that the structures, the institutions are in place, but the system and the systems as they're practiced are just so endemically complicated, and which leads to things like excessive workload, etc., that that it sort of renders available institutions dysfunctional?
You could improve the quiz system of justice if you were to increase the number of judges by 200-300%. But then where would you get these good judges from? We don't have that sort of resource base. Even many of our judges right now, I mean, frankly, they're not equipped to be judges. But there's a shortage of, and our training colleges and universities are pretty pathetic. I mean, I don't have to tell you guys that, which is why you're here. So,
okay, you wanted to ask, was there anyone else apart from the two of them? You have a question. You first, you second, so you third.
You mentioned Khuzdar a few minutes ago. The issue of Balochistan has always been very sensitive for the military establishment. So as a journalist, how different was it for you or your peers when it came to covering the rest of the country and then covering Balochistan?
Balochistan is basically, they've divided it into A areas and B areas, and journalists also into that category. Balochistan and those tribal areas are run by the military. They may have a facade of Sardars in parliament and so on, but at the end of the day, the local military bigwig runs those things. And journalists are severely circumscribed because power is somewhere else. And so therefore, they know the situation. What more?
We are running out of time. Do you want to ask your question?
So,
And I might add that one of the problems in those areas is insurgencies. So they have these extra, they've acquired these extra powers and no accountability, of course. And then there are disappearances, and the whole ball game is completely different.
So basically, like while you were mentioning about the bureaucracy of judiciary and how it's like a problem in proper due process, my question is more about like the politics of it. So do you think that like at the higher level of Supreme Court, judges feel threatened to hold this military to account because they always feel threatened by them, taking the example of Qazi Faiz case? And secondly, do you think there's like institutionally, the judiciary is structured in a way like we have the Supreme Judicial Council, which is not transparent enough, which allows the military to exploit that loophole in whipping the judges and keeping them in line so that they serve their purpose? And if they don't, if they make if they put a challenge against the military, they're basically punished like Qazi Faiz was.
Mandated, popular, elected prime ministers have not been able to hold the military accountable. Do you think a guy wearing a wig is going to be able to do that? This is an all-powerful institution. It's pervasive, it's everywhere, and it makes its power known, and in fairly black and white terms. It is an irresistible force, and there aren't any immovable objects around.
Okay. Well, I think, did you want to say anything by way of conclusion?
By way of conclusion, all I can say is this, that
I can't say you've painted a particularly, I was going to say rosy, but even that seems inappropriate, particularly edifying picture. On the other hand, it's been very interesting hearing you speak as someone with your kind of experience in the media to also say that you agree, especially in the case of the example you gave from the United States that we all know about of the 6th of January, about how freedom of any and every sort, including freedom of speech, is not and cannot be an absolute right. So it's very interesting to see how, you know, those who support freedom of speech and speak for it are also navigating a complicated and difficult path. But please.
I must tell you, I don't know of any senior journalist, forget about senior, I don't know of any journalist who would say that freedom is, that they, you know, doesn't come without responsibility. There can't be any freedom without responsibility. You have to be responsible. That's what civil society is about. The whole notion of freedom as we know it in Western civilization is grounded in certain other realities, social and political realities. I mean, you have tribal freedoms, but those are very different types of freedoms, of the sort of freedom we are talking about. In tribal society, there are no restrictions on anybody saying anything, but then there are no restrictions on anybody picking up a gun and shooting you. That's it. That's tribal honor. Redeem your honor, and that's it. Or you sit together and redeem somebody's honor by victimizing somebody's woman, and so on. And what do you do when you're in that situation? But the notion of freedom as we know it is a complicated one. It's rooted in a lot of traditions. We tend to pull it out and thrust it into situations where it often looks like anarchy or control. And so therefore, we end up facing these dilemmas. But these dilemmas exist even in advanced liberal constitutional societies, which is why the constitutional is the social contract of civil society. And judges and others have been trained and geared in cultures that have been blossoming for 200, 300, 400 years. And therefore, there is validity to, in our part of it, we've inherited post-colonial structures. We hardly ever understood them. They were used to control us and manage us, and now we're using them to control and manage ourselves. That's what's happening.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Sethi. This was been both a pleasure as well as an honor. Thank you to Pakistan Development Society.